The Lykovs did not immediately find themselves in Altai. The old believers, who had known each other for many years and lived in close proximity, and those who were in kinship with the Lykovs, said that they came to Siberia from the Nizhny Novgorod province and, having passed the stone belt, settled on the Iset River, a tributary of the Tobol. I do not know the exact date of the Lykovs' arrival in Siberia, but from the stories of relatives we know that Karp Osipovich's great-grandfather was born in the Yalutorovsk district of the Tobolsk province. The first of the Lykovs to come to Altai were the cousins, Severyan and Yefim. The Tobolsk province, where they lived for several decades, the Lykovs left under Alexander I. But the surname Lykov sounded much earlier in Altai. Compiling the list of fugitive people who are hiding in the stone of various ranks and who entered the yasak with their families, perpetrated during the description of the Bukhtarma tracts of 1792, Untershihmaster Lavrenty Fedenev adds Ivan Lykov, a former peasant of the Anuisk settlement, to the list of fugitives. Who he is, when and where he came from in Anuiskaya Sloboda, whether he is a relative of these Lykovs, it is impossible to say now, and there is no need for this. Most likely a namesake. The Lykov brothers who came to Altai picked up the valley of the Iset River with the help of close acquaintances who had previously left here. It is a large right tributary of the Khakassia River. Iset is about 170 km long, and the basin area is over 3,300 square km. Exceptionally fertile places. Fine soils, mixed forests and taiga wilderness, an abundance of fur-bearing animals and ungulates, in particular, the largest among real deer, the red deer and the Siberian roe deer, the latter was a great many. As for the fish, the Iset and its tributaries literally swarmed with these representatives of the aquatic kingdom. And the herbaceous vegetation in the Altai mountains. By the variety of species, the place is rare, and by the size of the plants it is not so easy to find such places. The horse, along with the rider, easily hides in the grass. In general, it must be said that in the northeastern Altaian foothills, where the most humid places, gigantism is observed in the plant world. The height of the grass cover reaches 2 or more meters. Many types of herbs bloom for a long time, so the honey harvest is rich, and the quality of the local honey is one of the best. In addition, Gorny Altai and its foothills abound in many valuable medicinal plants. After all, it is very important to always have a natural pharmacy at hand for the treatment and maintenance of health. That attracted such places. It was not for nothing that the people said that where the old believers live, the places are rich. Kurjaks will not live in a bad place. The Lykovs settled in the village of Khakassia, located in the valley of a small river of the same name, a tributary of the Iset. This village was founded around 1800 by old believers who came from Russia and the Tobolsk province. We settled in quickly. With centuries of experience, taking into account almost everything that was required to create, first of all, stocks of food, fodder for livestock and horses and housing, all migrants working, as the people said, tirelessly in a short time created tolerable conditions for life. A little later, Severyan's son Yakov left Khakassia with his young wife and settled on the left bank of the Katyn in the village of Nizhny Novgorod. Their relative Agafia Lykova also settled there. These families are out of luck. Now it is difficult to say how they angered the authorities, what caused the persecution. It is only known that all the Lykovs were distinguished by their firmness in faith, courageous judgments and open statements about the Tsar and the Orthodox Church. Apparently, intemperance in conversations was the bone of contention, and at the very beginning of the 20th century, the authorities took up these families thoroughly, right up to the interim governor-general. And on November 10, 1906, his order to the beast police chief appeared, which said, for extremely vicious behavior, evict the peasants Kirill and Ilarion Isav and Yakov Severianovich Lykov from the borders of the Tomsk province. 6 more years later, the Tomsk spiritual consistory demands to immediately execute the Governor-General's decree of January 26, 1912 and to evict Agafia Lykova from the Tomsk province. The beast police chief fulfills this order, and these old believers disappeared somewhere in Siberia. Vasily Skorokodov, who came with the Lykovs to Altai, did not stay long in Khakassia. Having heard about the healing spring on Abokan, Vasily managed to visit it, got acquainted with the surrounding area, and here in the Bol Valley. Abokan, in the place where the river almost stopped its run, on the wide left bank chose a place to live. In the upper reaches of the Abokan, this is the only place where the river has formed a rather wide valley. It flows there so calmly that the movement of water is almost imperceptible. The hunters who visited these places called this place Silence. This was the name of the settlement founded by Vasily Stepanovich Skorokodov, who moved here with his family for a permanent residence, according to the old residents of those places. During the reign of Alexander i.e., other young families followed him, and soon the settlement of Tisha turned into a village. In the 90s of the X century, the son of Ivan Lykov, Osip Efimovich, moved here with his family. Resettlement to the upper reaches of the Bol. Abokan and the settlement of its valley took place from Altai. The route of movement was chosen as the most convenient and passed first through the valleys of the Bayer rivers, then along its right tributary, the Swan River, and, having overcome a relatively simple pass through the Abokan Ridge, in the area of Lake Sadranskoye descended into the Bol Valley. Abokan along its left tributaries Beshar Albas. Therefore, both in the village of Tishi and in other numerous settlements, almost all residents were from Altai. Their relatives remained in Altai, and the connection was constant. Inhabiting these taiga places, the old believers uprooted the taiga, cleared the mows, skillfully burned the slopes of the mountains facing the south, the so-called sunbaths. The burned out areas were overgrown with raspberries, Ivan tea and other melliferous plants. This made it possible to collect rich honey bribes, and each had small apiaries of 5 or 6 hives. Traveling hundreds of kilometers through the mountain taiga through passes, mountain rivers, swampy areas was a difficult, time-consuming and to some extent dangerous business. It was necessary to transport not only household items, but also grain for sowing, poultry, carpentry tools, agricultural implements, overtake cattle, in short, everything necessary so that upon arrival at the chosen place, you could calmly arrange your life. And all in a packway. There are no roads, only paths. Sometimes we moved with small children and even babies. Naturally, it is impossible to transport everything at one time, so I had to make several trips. They settled where they liked it, where, in modern terms, it was possible to conduct a complex economy. Experienced people, they accurately selected places for settlement, having previously studied the soil. The study mainly consisted of rubbing her in the palms, and this was enough to determine her fertility. Visual inspection of the area also made it possible to determine the possibilities of keeping livestock and apiaries. Well, the taiga and the dense network of mountain rivers and lakes provided everything else. They did not forget about the soul. In addition to the indicated properties of the area, they tried to build a house, where it was more beautiful, where there is more sun, so that the soul rejoices. I remember once in a conversation my friend's father, Parfenty Filomonovich Kazanin, when I asked where and how they initially stayed when they moved to another place, smiling, said, "They settled under the fir. Without disturbing the natural balance, they cut down houses and outbuildings. Dead cedars were cut for the floor, ceiling, jambs and the device of the beds. Light, soft cedar wood lends itself well to processing. In addition to these qualities, which is very important during construction, cedar has a pleasant smell and a beautiful pale pink color. Damp-growing cedars were not chopped, there was enough dead wood and windbreak." The old believers understood perfectly well that cedar is not only wood, it is a high-calorie nut that is consumed by almost all animals and birds living in the taiga. Consequently, where there is a cedar, there is an abundance of fur-bearing animals, hoofed and game birds. Thus, the taiga complex was a stable support in creating a healthy life. Pine nut was one of the most important food products, given by the nature of the taiga. Children in old believer families grew up face to face with nature and, like no one else, learned its laws from an early age. Spring floods, thunderstorms, heavy rains, landslides in the mountains, forest fires, hurricane winds, snowstorms, avalanches and severe frosts, all this has been seen and felt from an early age. And already at an early age they understood and knew where, when and what to fear and how to behave in any natural phenomenon. Plus, every day, Varied peasant labor made these people physically strong, smart, with a special grasp and reaction to any surprise. The children of Osipovich grew up in such an environment, and did not differ in anything special from their peers. In total, his family had 9 children, and by seniority they were located as follows: Daria, Stepan, Karp, Anna, Evdokim, Nastasia, Alexandra, Theoctista and Kionia. The last 4 daughters died as children from various diseases. Having matured, the young guys tried to get to know the Taiga expanses, visit other places where people live, see cities, and stay with relatives. And the communication was frequent. All of them had horses, so there were no problems. We chose the time, saddled the horses, and set off. Well-fed, hardy horses covered tens of kilometers of mountain taiga during daylight hours, overcoming passes, mountain rivers and other obstacles. Taiga paths were in excellent condition in those years. It was a time when the entire vast territory of western Siberia, especially its south, was quite densely populated. Almost all places where it was possible to run a household were developed, and this resettlement gradually continued. The settlements were in 1 yard, in 2 or 3 yards, small settlements. There were hundreds of thousands of such villages and villages. In a word, it was a dense network of settlements. While exploring new places, we tried to preserve nature as carefully as possible, knowing full well that taiga, vegetation, water are the main companions of well-being. Each farm had horses, cattle, sheep, sown area, etc. I must say that these were mostly strong farms. The peasants tried to acquire high-yielding cows, hardy horses, were constantly engaged in selection. They bought, exchanged with each other, and thus raised highly productive livestock, raised high grain yields. And Siberia has never known hunger. When asked if there is enough grain for a year, from harvesting to harvesting, any peasant could answer. And we never saw the bottom at the bottom of the barrel. Susak was a separate compartment in the barn, where the grain harvested from the fields was poured. Siberia has never had either landowners or serfdom. Siberia was the largest supplier of grain, meat, or wool and other agricultural products not only to the domestic market of Russia, but also to European markets. Russia sold hundreds of thousands of tons of butter to Europe alone and received almost as much gold for it as was mined in the country. The well-organized Union of Butter Artels of Siberia was engaged in the production and trade of butter. Everyone knows about the largest annual fairs in Russia, which attracted buyers from many countries in Europe and Asia. They knew that the agricultural products of Russian peasants are one of the best in the world, especially products from Siberia. All peasant families were large. 5-7 children are common. The improvement of peasant life especially sharply went up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Perhaps these were the best years of the Russian peasantry in Siberia. Low stable prices made it easy for peasants to purchase agricultural machinery, which significantly increased labor productivity. In the newspapers of the pre-revolutionary period, one can find articles that spoke of the extraordinary rise of agriculture, industry and population growth, especially in Siberia. Some articles reported that the world community is concerned about the unprecedented growth of the Russian population in Siberia, which could affect food shortages and reduce supplies to Europe. These panicky articles had nothing to do with reality. In Siberia, many times more could live freely than they lived, and even more could increase the amount of agricultural products produced, and feed not only Russia, but also half of Europe. But a lot has changed with the advent of Soviet power. All estates were abolished, terrible persecutions of religion began, expressed in the plundering and destruction of churches, the physical destruction of priests by hanging and executions, and not only Orthodox, but also shamans, etc. All this was done deliberately and purposefully, with a written instruction from the authorities. How could the peasants, the bulk of the population of Russia, mostly religious, react to such vandalism? Of course it's negative. Fearing reprisals, people hid, quieted down. I must say that when the Tatar-Mongol invasion swept through Russia in a terrible whirlwind, then, according to historians, the oppressors did not destroy a single Orthodox church, cathedral, did not trample the faith of people into the mud. With the advent of such a new Bolshevik regime, dictatorship began. They took away the bread from the peasants, sometimes not leaving the family for food or seeds. The hungry time has come. A deadly fire hurricane swept through the civil war, leaving behind numerous bands of marauders and robbers. After the civil war, however, there was a short period of time when the peasants were left alone, and they, yearning for the land, took up the usual peasant labor. It was nep, many later said that it was a good time. We worked with Joe. Nobody intervened, and there were no restrictions on anything. On the contrary, the local authorities kind of urged on and forced to sow more and increase the number of livestock. But this did not last long. The people were worried when ominous rumors spread that everything would be common. One question especially worried the peasantry: collectivization. Discussing the issue that worried everyone, allegedly they will select and socialize horses, livestock and even poultry, everyone was in some bewilderment. In the second half of the 20s, this was the most pressing topic. People were lost in conjectures, many did not understand and could not believe these incomprehensible rumors. Collectivization was rapid. The main task is to unite all peasants without exception into collective farms, the so-called collective farms. And not only people, but also livestock, cows, horses, agricultural machinery, etc., regardless of anyone or anything. All this was done almost in an orderly manner. For refusing to enter the collective farm, all the so-called kulaks, part of the middle peasants, were deprived of everything, evicted from their own homes and exiled to Nurim. In essence, the kulaks and middle peasants were the most laboring part of the peasantry. In Russia, from time immemorial, people have united in artels, brigades on a voluntary basis, with a targeted direction. These were fishing, carpentry, trade and different types of cooperatives. And such a forcible unification of not only people, but also the means of production led to a terrible collapse of agriculture in the country, and the peasant life that had developed for centuries collapsed at once. And now, from the heights of bygone days, you wonder how this could have happened, who and how invented this reform. Why it was necessary to ruin agriculture, the basis and support of the state. It all looked like a return to serfdom. Collective farmers were not given passports, were not allowed to move anywhere, etc. Serfdom existed for 268 years, from 1593 to 1861. There were still some old people who remembered the difficult time, and especially for them, such a setting of the case was, to put it mildly, surprising. It must be admitted that the problems of the Russian peasantry have not really been resolved to this day. Maybe someone will someday muster up civil courage and write a true history of the Russian peasantry. And I think now, did the great Russia really need only a Stolypin? Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video, and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafia Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching.